I'm sure it won't be a big deal if I get us started with 1 minute to spare.
I think so. I think you can go ahead and get us started.
Yeah. So this is a exciting lunch and learn in December. I hope if you're watching, it's because you have a New Year's resolution you've already thought about starting a podcast in 2021. So you're in the right place. And to start off, I just want to say, as always, thank you to Do Space for letting me do this little workshop to help people get started. Really means a lot to me. So I enjoy doing it too. And the first thing I'm going to do is paste in the chat a link to the Google Doc, because this presentation I've built has tons of links in it and resources. So I want you to be able to utilize those. And you're gonna have a little homework, I think, just depends. So a little bit about me and why I feel like I can do this and share this information with you. I'm a former journalist. I've worked at a couple stations here in Omaha, in Orlando, and in Sioux City. So that's what I did for a while right out of college. And then I transitioned into marketing, and now I'm working on my own documentary. Don't ask me how long it's taking, because it's one of my shames. But also the last 2 years, I've become a small business owner. I do operate with my husband a podcasting studio. So we help people get their podcasts started. That's enough about me. Let's move on. So what we're going to do in this Lunch and Learn is take a real brief look at the history of podcasting and some of the trends that are looking into the future. And that's going to just give you a good base to think about how to develop your idea. And this is where you'll have some homework. You'll have, I'm going to give you a lot of questions that you need to ask yourself. And then we're just going to touch on the very tip of recording and editing resource equipment and how to edit. Not necessarily how to edit, but what to use. And then we'll do a kind of a little dive into hosting and RSS and how that equals a podcast. And then finally, we'll just kind of touch on how to measure your success. So let's get to it. First off, I always like to ask this question: what are you listening to? And if you want to just type them in the chat, that'll be fun. In the Do Space classroom, this is normally like where I just ask people to shout them out. And some of the most common podcasts are like the Joe Rogan Experience, or the Serial series, which we'll talk about how important that is here in a moment, and then countless others. And the reason I do this exercise and want you to think about what you're listening to is because it really shows you the variety of types of podcasts that exist in the world currently. Now that's a good thing, because whatever your idea is or your voice is, you provide a unique perspective. And I want you to remember that as you're getting started, to not be intimidated by everything else that's already out there. So the history of podcasting really begins in the early 2000s when the iPod is invented. That really changed the game. I don't know about a lot of you. I was in high school, and when kids started bringing their iPods to school, I don't know why I'm sharing this, but like, it was amazing. You had all this music in your pocket instead of carrying around, the CD flip folder and Walkman. So there's that. Next is when Apple integrated podcasts into the iTunes software. And so this really became a game changer, because that is what created discoverability for podcasts. And so that directory is still super important and one of the main resources for podcasters to be found. In 2009, this is a milestone moment, because there's a research firm out there called Edison, and they do a survey called Share of Ear. And they ask people, have you ever even heard of the word podcasting? Now, you don't necessarily have to know what it means, but just have you heard the word? And in 2009, 43% of respondents said, yeah, I've heard the word. But if you want to jump to 2018, the same survey asked the same question. And finally, a majority of Americans have heard of the term podcasting, 64%. And that's just grown as well. I need to look for the most recent survey and update that. But it just goes to show you over that course of 9 years, again, podcast has always just been on the up curve. So there's more to come. Then in between those years, there's a couple milestone moments. In 2013, Apple announced there were 1 billion podcast subscribers. So that was a big deal. And then in 2014, this is where Serial comes in. That when that series came out and it became part of like the pop culture lexicon, that really changed the game for the potential, what people saw as the potential for podcasting and how it could be used. And you'll see, I'm going to share another article with you about how this year true crime has been like the leading most popular podcast genre. And if you want to dive deep into it, the source for this timeline is here for International Podcast Day. And if you want to mark your calendar, it should be September 30th, 2021. Next. Oh dear, whoopsie. Sorry about that. Stand by. Back to the presentation. There we go. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so this is the section I like to call podcasting with purpose. And this just goes, I provided some recent articles that show you the different ways people and companies are using podcasting, okay? So this first article is from Fortune, their website, and they're talking about how Walmart, Trader Joe's, Nike, and others are using podcasting for corporate communications, not just with their employees, but also with customers. And they're kind of integrating that internal and external communication into one by having their employees speak to like store trends. So like store managers and things like that are featured on the Walmart podcast. And they're sharing that too with customers and how things are going during the coronavirus adjustments that they've had to make. So that's pretty interesting if you're thinking of podcasting for your business's marketing purposes. Speaking of that, business or personal branding. The article I've shared with you is how Netflix is using podcasting. And really, I love the way Netflix is using it, and even HBO now. They're basically like the behind the scenes commentary that you would have gotten on a DVD. You'll hear from the writers, the producers, the actors on whatever show. There's a Stranger Things podcast. There's a Lovecraft Country podcast. So it just really complements their streaming programming. The third bullet there, amplifying marginalized voices. So Spotify has an actual program to support diversity in podcasting for women of color. It's 2 or 3 years now, and it was open in like July, August, September. So if you pull up that link and mark your calendar for around that time, like late summer, the next application process should be coming around. And then the fourth bullet there, digital marketing. If you work in digital marketing, content creation, SEO, social media management, all those things, you've probably heard the term content is king. And that's true. You need content to share to build that relationship with your customers. But the second half of that phrase is distribution is queen. And so distribution means how you're getting your messaging out there, whether it's email, social media, or just organic, all those things. And that builds into what's called an integrated strategy. So that includes your website, your Google ads, if you're doing Facebook advertising and you want that pixel, social, using influencers and all those things. So a podcast is a really versatile tool that can be repurposed into all those things. So that's why I really advocate for it. This since about March, April, there's been some industry changes as to how people are doing podcasting and trying to get their recording done remotely with guests and co-hosts and that sort of thing to keep social distancing and be compliant with those things. So what I've built into this slide is a bunch of articles about the different ways people are doing it. And it boils down to kind of like what we're doing right now. We're in a Zoom video conference and able to record that, whether it's recording through Zoom or recording through your own mixer. There's so many different ways you can do your setup and based on what equipment you have or what tools you have access to. And that's one of the things too I want you to keep in mind. The barrier to entry for podcasting is so low. If you have a recording device and a way to save your file, you have the ability to podcast. So that's pretty exciting. And then in April and March, around that time too, there were some changes to listener habits, and that's kind of what these Write To articles sort of document. And there was a decline for a little bit there, a few weeks, but it's pretty much bounced back to normal as people have figured out, when their listening time is, what their workflows are, from working from home and figuring all those things out. And so now things have pretty much returned to normal. So here's where we get into the fun stuff. And this is where you're going to have some homework, okay? The very first question to ask yourself is, what is the mission for your show? Okay, you're going to write 2 to 3 sentences, and that's your mission statement that will guide you as you're developing your episode ideas, even just your general idea of how you want to do your show, because that will keep you consistent and headed toward accomplishing what goals you have. So what is the mission of your show? Answer that question, and everything else should just kind of fall into line. So you want to write a mission statement for your show. And as you're thinking about that sort of thing, there is some more questions to ask, like when is a good idea for a podcast, maybe a bad idea for a podcast. And what I mean by that is you can dive into a really niche topic, but is that a single episode or do you have an entire show? And so what I've linked to you here that if you on your own time you could listen to is a episode from transom.org. They're a great resource for radio storytelling. And he talks with this producer who won a pitch contest. And her idea was finding very niche news of the day on big news days. So on 9/11, her first episode, on 9/11, the news of the day was the terrorist attack. And she, though, found there was other things happening, in particular with marine biology. And these marine biologists were able to gather so much more research than ever before, because if you think about it, everything stopped on that day. Air traffic, shipping traffic, regular traffic. And so scientists were able to hear more in the ocean than they were ever able to. So she had a really good first episode, and then as she got into other episodes, it became harder and harder because you have to get down to that 7th page of Google or you know what I mean, your Google results. But there's a really good quote from her. I'm just going to read it to you. I think that if you're going to give yourself a really narrow focus for your project, that you need to have the whole thing mapped out before you go forward, or at least the first half, because it's Murphy's Law. And no matter how good your idea is, doesn't mean it's going to be easy to get it to exist in the world. So just a bit of advice there from Arwen Nix. The next thing is, what type of show are you going to do? There's kind of 4 main types, and I'm just going to go through them, and I've provided some examples. The first one is a scripted podcast, and it's basically like a radio drama. And the example I provided to you is Homecoming, which has gone on to become an Amazon Prime show. So something to keep in mind for you creative types. Narrative, that's like documentary storytelling style. You have objective copy, subjective sound. So you're interviewing people and you're pulling that emotion out from them, and then you're telling a story through your narration. The example I provided for you is Serial. Magazine style, it's where you're interviewing guests. Mark Maron has a very good show called WTF, and he just interviews people, comedians, celebrities, authors, that sort of thing, and just has really good in-depth interviews with them. Q&A panels, pretty much what it sounds like. If you're doing events sometime in the near future, hopefully, you can record that as a podcast and put it up there on your podcast channel. So that's kind of an overview of the type of show to think about. Now we're getting into more genres. This is from third quarter of last year, the top most listened to podcast genres. Comedy leads the way, followed by news, society, culture, sports, true crime. And then just today in my email inbox is this article. Ooh, let's see if I can get to it. And I'm just going to pull it up for us. Oh, dear. Here we go. Yoink. Copy. New tab. So this list came out today, and the top of that is Nice White Parents, and that was like another serial season. Down the Hill, true crime, true crime, true crime, true crime. So we're seeing a trend here, I think, people. Lots of true crime. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Comedy. The Scrubs guys. So really interesting. And so this is built into that page of the presentation. So feel free to dive a little further if you're into that sort of thing. But just really funny to look through that list and maybe pull some ideas or some inspiration. So more questions. Here we go. Frequency. That means how often are you planning to do your show? Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? A lot of times I've seen people start off monthly and ramp up to more frequent. So whatever works for your schedule. But when you're thinking about that, you've also got to work in that record time and when your guests are available. Also, the editing time and the turnaround for that for when you want to release your episodes. So keep that in mind in your planning process. Span. So there is a real thing out there called pod fatigue, an industry term there for you. And basically, like you're on this uphill of being so excited for your show and your passion project or your creative idea, and you're into it. And then after a while, it can feel like no one's listening, or you're just getting worn down, and that's pod fatigue. And then you don't want to do it anymore. So set yourself up for breaks. And so decide, are you going to try and do a year's worth of weekly episodes? That's 52, keep in mind. Or aim for more of a seasonal, like, spring through summer, and then take fall and winter off, that sort of thing. Whatever works for your schedule is really going to be the deciding factor there. And the next question is length. How long do you want your podcast to be? 30 minutes, an hour, more? Depends again on the content. So that next line there, answer should be content driven. There's no right or wrong answer. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So keep that in mind in your planning. Then some tips, some more keys to success: a compelling host or guide. Someone, if you're doing marketing with your podcast, make sure that they don't sound like an advertisement, and have that skill to be vulnerable and open, because your podcast audience is very going to be very loyal. They're known for loyalty to who they're listening to, and so that you want to be able to develop that relationship. And listening with like headphones or earbuds is a very kind of intimate experience, so they can't be like, you have to have a nice voice, that sort of thing. A unique format to pull in the listener, that just depends again on your content and how you want to accomplish that. Get specific. Don't plan to just talk pop culture. Dive into a specialized topic. There are podcasts out there about just He-Man. So you really have the opportunity to get real into a specific topic and grow around that audience. And finally, regularity matters. Be reliable to that audience. It's just like any relationship you've ever been in. If someone's not there for you and you have needs and wants, you'll go somewhere else to get those needs and wants fulfilled. So if you as a podcaster aren't there for your audience, they will go somewhere else. So be regular. And if you can't be regular, like say something comes up, communication matters the most there. So things happen, life happens. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. So here is where I like to take a moment and just give you some resources and a little word of caution. Copyright and fair use. There's myths out there that like you can use 10 seconds of a popular song and not get in trouble for it. That's not true. If it's not something you created, you technically don't have the right to use it. Now there's a defense for that that's called fair use, and that's usually for like educational or news commentary. So the main point is if you use something that you didn't create, you must be prepared to defend it. So if you get like a cease and desist, and you want to defend it, you must be prepared to pay a lawyer, to go to court, and all that process. So that's what I'm not a lawyer, but that's kind of what I advise, is just don't do it. The second most common question that I get is, if you have guests, should they sign a release form? The correct answer is yes. Just want to mind your P's and Q's, and cross those T's and dot those I's, and have them sign off on that form. And be prepared too, and as you're developing your relationship with your guests, that they may help them not say anything they might regret, and talk through the content idea that you have for their episode, that sort of thing, so that they are prepared to talk openly, but also be cautious about what they say, because they can come back to you and ask you to take that episode down, and you need to be prepared for how you're going to handle that. So just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about guests. And then finally, sponsorship and monetizing with ads. The main tip I have for you there is the requirement for transparency. You must offset like a paid read by revealing to your audience that that is paid for by the sponsor. So, and there's a really good article about that there. Now we get into what a podcast crew is. And this is actually a discussion I just saw in one of my Facebook groups about titles and things for your podcast, for people who are helping with your podcast. Because there's, the professional side of podcasting, and then there's the indie creators, and so your podcast crew will look different. It may just be you, which is perfectly fine. But I want you to realize that you are wearing a lot of hats, and you should give yourself kudos for that. So typically there is a producer, someone who is editing. By editing, I mean like writing, and writing copy and questions and doing research, and doing some of that pre-production preparation of arranging guests and that sort of thing. Then there is the editor. That is kind of the boss person. They are overseeing editorial decisions when it comes to like content and deciding what to include, what not to include. There's the sound designer, and this is the individual who is editing the audio files and putting them together, mixing the audio for each show. And then finally, there's the host, who you could also call the talent. They're the voice of the show, and they're kind of the face as well for the show. So, and again, if this is all you deserve so many accolades for accomplishing this for every episode. It's a lot of work, so more power to you. Now we're going to get into a little bit about recording. The main things to know about recording is there's lots of ways you can do it, but you want to set yourself up for capturing the best sound. One of the best advice I like to share from my news experience came from one of our photographers, and he basically said, when it comes to when you're on your day off and you're out there in the city and you see breaking news, most likely like a car crash or something like that, what's the best thing to shoot video with? Whatever you have available. You can't run back to the news station, grab a camera, go back to the scene and get your video. You will miss things. So I use that same philosophy when it comes to video and my own individual indie projects and podcasting. Like, what's the best thing to record with? Whatever you have available. If it's your phone, use it. If you have a little recorder, use it. If you buy a Bluetooth USB microphone, use it. So don't be intimidated by the equipment someone else has. That's actually like a really popular thing in the podcast groups on Facebook. They like to share their setup. And that's great, but like you can podcast with what you have available to you. So don't be intimidated. The main thing to know is there's two kind of different types of microphones. There's a USB microphone and an XLR microphone. And then there's also a recording device. So that's what I have pictured here. There's cheap little microphone amplifiers you can attach to your phone. You can buy them off Amazon and utilize those for recording yourself or your guest. And then the next step up would be these kind of mobile recording devices. What I've pictured here is a Zoom H4n. And there's others out there. You could take them out to a field. I used a Zoom H1N, so a lower version, at a music festival and just interviewed people attending the festival. And I got great sound. And I mean, you hear the background noise, but it's a festival. So that just provides the ambiance. A USB microphone that I have pictured next is the Blue Yeti. That's really, really popular and totally usable. The one thing to keep in mind with USB microphones is there's a little bit of difficulty in using more than one at a time, but there's workarounds for it. So you just have to dig into that. And then finally, there's the XLR microphone, which is usually more of a professional grade equipment. It's hooked to a mixer. So there's an XLR cord. It's like 3-prong cord that hooks into the microphone, then hooks into a mixer, and the mixer hooks into a computer where you're recording your sound file. So it's a little bit more setup, a little bit more expensive. But knowing the type of show that you're planning to do can help you determine the best equipment to use. If you're planning to be out in the city, out in the field, definitely use your phone or a mobile Tascam recorder and use that out in the field. If you are planning to record in your basement or your home office or at work, a USB type microphone might be more suitable. And if you're really gung-ho, and the other thing too, before I get to that, is like you can start small and upgrade as you progress. Absolutely. So start with a recorder, and eventually you want to start recording in a space, build up to that mixer and more professional quality. Getting the best sound. So the number one rule of getting the best sound, wear headphones. At the very minimum, earbuds like you see me wearing. At the most, like sound canceling professional headphones. I do recommend wired though, because with Bluetooth, number one, it's not always reliable. And number two, you could get some lag. So I stick with the wired just to avoid those things and not have to troubleshoot them in the moment. Next, location. Look for places to record where there's lots of things around you that can help absorb the sound. So curtains, carpeted floors, artwork, that sort of thing, because it'll keep the sound from bouncing around you. And then finally, well, not finally, but more, microphone placement. Keep your microphone about a fist length away. If you're interviewing someone, don't let them hold it. People who are being interviewed typically get a little nervous, which is perfectly okay, and they fidget. And so if they're fidgeting, they may rustle the microphone or the cord and create sound that you can't get rid of in post-production. So don't let them hold it. And then also, most recording devices have a way you can monitor levels, like just an indicator. And so keep an eye on those levels, because if your level is peaking, it will, and that just means the monitor is going all the way to the top. The sound will get real crunchy and you can't fix that in post. So, and that's really hard to listen to as well. It gets distorted. Now, if you're interviewing someone, start with easy questions. The one I like to start with is just to ask them to say and spell their name, because then you have the pronunciation on your recording and you have the spelling on your recording. And spelling someone's name, especially like in your web copy, is super important. It's just, it'll make sure your guest is appreciated. And then the last thing, this is really, really easy to forget. I know I do it all the time. I forget. Get what's called room tone. And that is just to sit there for about 15, 20 seconds in silence while you're recording, because that is basically recording the ambience of the room. If you're quiet, you may hear traffic outside. You may hear a fan that's going nearby, or just the air conditioning, or a pet, that sort of thing. Just these little sounds that add to the ambience around you. Because if you have pure silence in your record track, that can actually be very uncomfortable to the listener, and it makes transitions kind of weird. So you put in your editing a little bit of that room tone, and it helps make that transition less jarring to the listener. Now, if you're doing your podcast by yourself and you're recording at home, build a blanket fort. All those blankets and pillows surrounding you will help keep the sound from bouncing around you, and it will sound, and also keep sound from coming at you. So if you are in a noisy environment, it can help muffle that. Remote interviewing, there are so many options. So that's why I've got kind of a long list here, and so many different, from free to pricing paid plans. So that's kind of basically what I recommend when it comes down to utilizing a remote service. Is it user friendly to your guest and cost? And then there's some extra tools, like some of them will record in the software. Some of them will transcribe for you, which is very cool. So it just depends on what your needs are, but there's what I recommend is trying out ones that best match your needs. With the most all of them have a free trial, so utilize what works best for you. Tips for your remote interview. So I've been setting up quite a few remote interviews lately, and this is literally a copy paste of what I send to the guest, because these just help improve the recording session that you will get by astronomical numbers. Okay, that very first thing I'm going to harp on is use headphones. Use your headphones, use your headphones, use your headphones, because it will just sound so much better. If you've ever been in a Zoom conference meeting for work or whatever, or a happy hour with your friends, and you all are just using the computer's microphone, there's usually sound problems or it's hard to hear someone because the room is so vast and their sound bounces around them. So that will help eliminate those problems, especially if you're using earbuds with a microphone built in. Another one common one I see is like those gaming headsets. You don't use them. Go grab your kid's headset and use it for your podcast session. The next thing is locate a quiet place, ideally a bedroom or your home office, wherever you won't be interrupted and that isn't a large room, because again, you want to keep that sound from bouncing. Put a sign on the door letting others know you're recording a podcast so they don't interrupt you. And also activate do not disturb on whatever device you're using, whether it's your phone or your computer. Especially if you're an Apple user, I don't know about you, if someone calls me, everything rings. So keep that from happening by activating that do not disturb. Also, keep a drink handy, but try to avoid drinking mid-sentence. You're talking a lot, so you're gonna get kind of thirsty. So having a drink nearby just helps is convenient. Then the last thing, especially depends, how good your internet service is. But one of the things I learned through doing kind of internet-based like live TV is when you have a lot of motion in the image that you're capturing, that generates more pixels in the picture, and generating more pixels creates more data, and more data takes up more bandwidth. And so you'll likely end up with buffering. So the less you move around, the better if your internet connection is kind of shoddy or poor. And then position your device, your phone or your computer somewhere where you don't have to hold it, so you'll be comfortable. Editing. So when it comes to editing your podcast, there is so much, there's a learning curve. And so what I want to just do is kind of give you a couple tips that work for me. Number one is helps me stay organized, and that's so important, naming your sound files. So I like to use a date, interviewee name, and the project description as kind of my naming convention, so I can go back and find things because things get lost real easily. And then finally, MP3 is what you use for generating the RSS feed, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Now, when it comes to what to use to edit, there is some free options out there, and then there's some paid options. Audacity is very common for people who are just getting started or have been doing it for a while. They just stick with it. It works, and that's free. So utilize that. GarageBand, if you're an Apple user, also free, also very common for people who are just getting started. Then there's a few others I've heard. I've never used Hindenburg, or I haven't used Pro Tools since college, and that was a long time ago. And then Adobe Audition is what I currently use. So, and pricing varies depending on if you have like the whole Adobe Creative Suite or just that one software. So keep that in mind. So when it comes to editing, that's all I really touch on because there's a lot you can learn. But what I recommend is if you have a library card, you can access the online resources on the Omaha Public Library website and go to lynda.com, log in with your library card, and you get all those Lynda classes for free. And that includes some editing courses. So that's where I would say is your best bet to learn editing. besides just like tons of YouTube videos. So that's where I would start for learning to edit. Now, here's the technical side of things. When you create a podcast, you have your recording, you've edited your sound file, and you're ready to go. Basically, what you have to do is give your sound file a place to live on the internet, and that's its little home, and that's what's called a hosting service or site. Once you've picked a hosting service, they will provide you an RSS link, and it's literally just a link, like a URL that will that you submit to the podcast listening platforms. And that includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podcatchers, countless others. There's so many, and it seems like more all the time. So then those listening platforms will auto aggregate your podcast as you upload new episodes. So whenever you have a new episode, you don't have to go to each of those platforms. You're just putting it in your hosting home, and it auto populates into those other places. And then some of these hosting services actually automate that first part of getting your RSS feed into those listening platforms. So that's something to keep in mind when you're choosing your hosting service. Now, there's paid options and there are free options. The most popular free option is Anchor, which is also owned by Spotify. And the only thing to keep in mind when it comes to these free services is when something is free, you're the product. So the biggest complaint I've seen lately is you don't have as much control over the type of advertisements that surround your podcast. The next kind of tier of free, not free, is SoundCloud. You get 3 hours free, and then there's a paid pricing plan. And then there's these top 3, Libsyn, Blueberry, and Podbean are the top 3 paid plans, and they range anywhere from $5 to $50 on up, depending on how long your podcast is. Because if you have a 3-hour podcast, the file is going to be bigger, so you need more storage space. Is how that works. And then if you suddenly blow up and are super popular, there's some that will charge if you exceed like how many downloads, that sort of thing. So it boils down to how much storage you need, the type of analytics, and some of them will provide like a free website and some other extras. So if that fits your goals, definitely go that route. You're probably wondering, well, which one do you use? I most commonly use SoundCloud just because it's so user-friendly and I do get the analytics that I want. It's not Interactive Advertising Bureau is one of the regulatory sort of organizations for digital marketing. And so some of these providers have IAB certified analytics. So, and that's really important if you're going to be seeking advertisers. They want to know about your audience. SoundCloud does show you like where people are listening from and other things. So that works for me. And so that's kind of an overview of how to choose a hosting service. Where do people get podcasts? These are what are called podcatchers, those listening platforms. It's pretty simple. Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Stitcher, iHeart, TuneIn, Audible, Spotify, more and more. And there's a list here. And then some people even just connect to your RSS feed and utilize that. So if you go a route where your hosting service doesn't automate that submission part, here's a link here that has links to each submission tool for Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, and I think Stitcher, and I think there might be a few more in this list. So it's a really good place to start. Those are kind of the big 4 main ones that you should pay attention to. The other thing you'll notice is once you're in the Apple directory, you'll be showing up in a lot of these other directories as well, because they just pull from Apple. So you're killing more birds with one stone by just submitting to Apple. Now, measuring your success. Obviously, download numbers is number 1. Reaching a new audience, and then building brand awareness. So the biggest thing I like to say when it comes to measuring success is, are you reaching your goals? Is your goal to tell a new story? Is your goal to kind of market your company and create content that you can cross utilize in other platforms? Because that's super useful. And then reaching new audience. So basically, once you're on a podcasting directory, you are already reaching a new audience. You're in that little swimming pool of podcast listeners, while your website is, among your customers already, and then your social media has its own swimming pool, and so you're in all these new swimming pools basically of potential listeners and audience. So and then I have linked to you the Public Radio Podcast Measurement Guidelines and the Interactive Advertising Bureau Technical Guidelines. They're all full of information that's useful, but also boring. So click at your own risk. So the extra resources that I think you'll find useful. I mentioned transom.org, the radio storytelling experts. They have so many tutorials and guides and just helpful information about telling stories through sound. Really useful. Then the next is the NPR Guide for Students. There's a really helpful glossary to help you learn those podcasting technical terms. The next one is a video about monetizing and the different ways you can do that. Below that is the Google Podcast Creator Podcasting 101. It's about 10 videos. I think it's like 45, maybe an hour to watch all of them. And it'll just reinforce everything that I've really told you. So definitely check that out. And then I've linked to the Omaha Public Library website where you can check out their online resources in that lynda.com section. And the great thing about Lynda too is once you complete a course, you can add it to your LinkedIn profile because they're owned by LinkedIn. Now, here is something you'll want to screenshot or print off for yourself. It's the podcast checklist. So I'm just going to read over it. Name your show and do a little research to make sure someone isn't already utilizing that name. Next, mission statement for your show. Don't forget to define your goals and what you want to accomplish. Those other questions: frequency, span, length, genre. Next, define the roles and expectations with yourself and anyone who's helping you. If you pick a buddy and you're like, yeah, we should start a podcast, really have that conversation about, okay, you're going to do this, be responsible for this, and I'm going to be responsible for this. And we're not just going to show up and not be prepared. So, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard of someone being like, yeah, I started a podcast with my friend, but they never add anything and they just show up, and I'm getting so tired. So you can help avoid that by having that conversation right up front. Your launch date. And when you know your launch date, you're going to backdate from there because you want to submit those RSS feeds before your launch date with like a teaser, a trailer, or even your first episode, really, because sometimes there can be a technical issue. I did have one about a year and a half ago now with Spotify, and I had to like contact support, and we wanted to launch on July 1st, and it didn't end up showing up in Spotify until like 4 days later. So just something to keep in mind. Next, your recording and your post-production schedule. You have to fit in that time and how much you have available to accomplish those things. So work that in. Next, you need artwork for your show, and there's a minimum and maximum size. I use a service called Canva to do a lot of my graphic design. A real graphic designer would be like, no, but it totally works. Just use it. Don't ever let anyone shame you for whatever tool you're using to accomplish what you need to accomplish. So if Canva works for you, make that graphic and you have your artwork. Next, music, intro, outro, bumps, stingers, if you're using any of that. There are copyright-free libraries out there, so utilize those. Then each episode will need a title and a description. And then if you want to get more in depth, you can add metadata. And I've linked to some things that you can dive into those. Then you choose your hosting service. To me, that was like the hardest decision, was choosing the hosting service. And I just reached out to another colleague in podcasting who operates the studio. I was like, how did you decide? He's like, well, this was the most user-friendly, so that's why we use it. And then, are you going to do a website? Are you going to do social media? So you need to get on those tasks as well associated with those. And that's your podcast checklist. Some more podcasting tools that I've come across here in the last few months. SpeakPipe is a really nifty little thing where people can like leave you a voicemail, so you can get some interactivity with your podcast and incorporate that. So that sounds like fun. Headliner is super awesome. It's a way to generate like social media videos using your sound file. You can add text, you can add a graphic. and all that. And it's just like a bunch of clicks and it's ready and you distribute on social media. Descript and Otter.ai are some transcription tools that are very useful, especially if you want to do really in-depth show notes or generate a blog for your website. You can utilize that to transcribe like in minutes. Canva, like I mentioned, I love Canva. And then I just added a article from voices.com about warming up your voice. So you can, there's some exercises that help you just maybe with pronunciation and your tone and just warming up your vocal cords, just like a real artist. And then finally, I just like to go through this slide, like, share, and review. There's some Omaha podcasts out there. And I don't have association with all of these, just a couple. But these are the ones I see through my social media journeys. Riverside Chats, I think that's on KIOS too. KIOS does make a Made in the Middle podcast. KFAB has Grow Omaha. Ask a Scientist, that is a podcast by someone who actually took this course. So that's really exciting. I love it. The Keep Kids Alive podcast is Omaha's own Keep Kids Alive Drive 25 nonprofit. The Melee podcast, I think that's with the Hi Omaha magazine. Hobby Show podcast, that is with the Hobbyplex down by Cherry Hills. They have a podcast about their races and stuff. Other Duties is Assigned, I haven't listened to yet, but I need to, is by a local principal, is what I was told. And Back Row Center, that's from Film Streams. So I love to see Omaha representing and that sort of thing. So I would love to hear if you do go ahead and start your podcast too. It makes me excited. So with all that, we've got a little bit of time. We can either call it a day or I can try and answer some questions if there are any. Let me find that chat.
Just answer some questions in chat. All the links on the presentation are in that Google Doc that you shared earlier, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Chatty McChat. Here we go. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to scroll up and go back. Ooh, someone's listening to anything genealogy related podcast. Ooh, Armchair Expert. Yes, Dax Shepard. Absolutely good one. Serial, The Atheist Experience. Ooh, Scarred for Life. Interesting. That's you, Bree.
Yeah, that's actually that's actually an Omaha podcast. A friend of mine does it, and he's a horror writer reviewer.
Oh,
and so they get people on and talk about like the movies that scared them as children.
oh my gosh.
And so yeah, it's a really good podcast. He's talked to a lot of really interesting people, some big directors in horror and just a whole bunch of things. He mentioned to me that he'd gotten to talk to, if anybody's familiar with Welcome to Night Vale, he got to talk to Cecil Baldwin the other
cool.
day. So,
what a great concept.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So I recommend it.
So relatable. Like we all have that movie that scarred us as a kid. That's funny. Okay. Where do we learn to edit? So YouTube has so many helpful videos, but also I recommend lynda.com and just search audio editing or even Adobe Audition or whatever service you're planning to use to edit. You'll find the resources for that. Is there a way to get a copy? Yes. Bree did a good job. Thank you. A lot of info in a short amount of time. Yes, I'm so sorry. I feel like I talk so fast, but it's a lunch and learn. So, and two, like take some time on your own and just pop through those links and all those different sites and you'll just discover so much. The other thing I recommend too is on Facebook, just search groups for podcasting, and you'll join these great communities that share resources and tips and tricks and things. I'm in a couple that are just for women. There's one called She Podcasts. Then there's Podcast Movement. That's the annual kind of convention for podcasters. They did it digital this year, so I didn't really pay attention, but they have a Facebook group too. Now in that one, there's a lot of people saying, hey, I'm going to start a podcast. What should I do? And I'm like, well, you should watch my Do Space webinar. I don't say that, but so there's a lot of that going on, but there's every once in a while, there's other helpful information in that group too, the Podcast Movement. So look for those podcast groups. They're great resources for just getting started and getting to know people, even finding other people to interview. So hopefully that's helpful. Do I recommend recording multiple episodes at a time, then posting them one at a time? Yes. So like if you want to do a marathon recording day, I recommend breaking out your episodes and releasing weekly or whatever frequency you want. But that's a great idea to work ahead and have stuff in the can, because like I said, life happens. So if something comes up and you're not able to release an episode, you have some in your pocket that you can release. News people would call it evergreen. So it's like a story idea that you can do like any day and get done and have in the 5 o'clock news. But I digress. Yes, I do recommend working ahead like that as far as recording multiple episodes at a time. If that works for your show, absolutely go for it. Share a link to a link to a podcast group for resources, i.e. where to share ideas with others. Sure, let me pause my sharing, stop share, and go find one of these lovely groups. Stand by. Facebook.com. Groupie groups. My groups turn on. Oh, okay. Here is the podcast movement community. Copy URL. Go back to chat. Paste. There's that one. That's a great starting point. Now, if you just want to talk editing, this is a great resource. And there's a guy named Steve that even has an email newsletter. Now this one is strictly editing though, so you can't really talk ideas and that sort of thing. You have to talk like editing. And then, oh yes, I love my Just Busters for female podcasters. I hope that's okay. And I mean, those are all really good places to start. Oh. Yeah. Podcasters Hangout. I don't know that I see a lot from Podcasters Hangout, but I'll share it with y'all anyway. And then again, like I said, if you go on and start your podcast, I'd love to hear it. It makes me excited. So please share. You're welcome. Thank you for attending. Thank you all for attending. I hope you do start a podcast and have a great 2021. And I just hope all great things for all of you. So cheesy. I'm sorry.
I think someone was wanting to know if there was an email they could reach you.
Oh, is that okay to share? I don't want to.
Yeah, you can share your email.
Okay. Yes, I will pop that in there. Boop. There you go. Thank you. Those were all great questions as well.
All right, friends, do we have any further questions? Doesn't look like it. Well, I think we're going to sign off for this week. Thank you for coming and talking to us about podcasting. And just while I'm thinking about it, you mentioned Canva. We use Canva here at Do Space quite a bit. Yes. Love it. Yes. And we actually had one of our social media experts talking about Canva a couple weeks ago, I think. and
Nice.
how you can use it for your business. So if you are interested in Canva, hit our YouTube channel. I know we've got a couple of different presentations now because we've had a couple of people talking about Canva. It's a great thing
So
for folks.
awesome.
Yeah, exactly. So I recommend that. And then this will be available on YouTube if you want to watch it again.
Yay.
And then if you just want to watch it again to get more information, we're going to run, excuse me, we're going to run it next month as well. So check the calendar for that. So
Yay.
thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.